Hello, and welcome to the Middle School Honor Band percussion tutorial for the FMCMEA Audition Music Intermediate Set C, written by Dr. Gary P. Gilroy. My name is David Gabrielson, and I'm one of the percussion faculty right here at the Fresno State University School of Music. In this video, we're going to be focusing on the snare drum portion of the audition page. That's the first 3 lines, measures 1 through 12. Right off the bat, we're going to start with 16th notes. And so we want to make sure that we understand how fast we're going to go. We have our metronome set to 120. Those 16th notes at the beginning are doing 2 things. First, they're crescendoing, getting louder, but there's also some accents added in there. Sometimes when we're learning about accents and non-accents, one way of thinking about them is to play the accents really loud and then to play the non-accented notes really soft. That really gives us a gigantic difference in the two. That helps us to understand how one note can pop out. However, in this context, we don't want there to be such a dramatic difference in the notes. We simply want the accents to be slightly louder than the surrounding notes. So, instead of sounding like this, where the accented note is dramatically louder, we want it to sound a little more subtle, something like this. Not that big of a difference. Then in the second half of the measure, it decrescendos back down, and then in measure 2, we're going to do the same thing, but now those 16th notes turn into a roll. This is really good because whenever we have a roll, there's always an underlying rhythm. In this case, we can use the skeletal pattern of the 16th notes from the first measure to let us know how fast to play the roll in the second measure. So you're simply going to play 16th notes and let those bounce. So that second measure could be played without the roll like this. If you just let those 16th notes bounce, now you have your roll. So when we put the first 2 measures together, you're going to get a nice opening statement, like this. In the third measure, now we drop way down softly. Sometimes we might be tempted to move really close to the edge of the drum. And this isn't really necessary. I think that a lot of times we move too close to the edge of the drum. Most of the dynamic change can be handled simply by lowering our heights. We can move somewhat closer to the edge, but if we get too close to the edge, we lose the snare response that we want. And on a softer volume, we really do want that snare response. So instead of going too close to the edge, like out here, maybe think halfway between the center of the drum and the edge. And we're going to play that third measure like this. That was the third and fourth measure put together. 16th note combinations with some accents placed in. Let's play the first 4 measures now together. Ready? Here we go. In the 5th measure, we're going to start mezzo forte, and we're going to crescendo to forte, and that really just gets us to the next measure, where we have a little more interesting things happen. So measure 5. The downbeat of measure 6 is where we're going to. 1 and, followed by an 8th note rest, then played very softly, and 3 E and 4. So if we put 5 and 6 together, it sounds like this. Now, measure 7. We have a ruff or a drag. This is simply a flam that we let the grace notes bounce. So you're just going to get this. Instead of a single grace note, you're just going to let that bounce. Followed by that big note. Think of the word zut, Z-U-T. A nice tight little zzz, little buzz, followed by the strong note. What we don't want to do, that often happens with young players, is that the grace notes are played too loud. That would sound like this. We want to keep those grace notes down as softly as possible so that we hear a small amount of buzzing, but we just hear a single big note, like this. Work on that, just like you would work on flames. Next, we've got simply some triplets with crescendos. Notice that going into measure 8, we have the same rhythm as we did in measure 6. The trick here is to go from the triplets back to 2 eighth notes. So triplet 1A, triplet 1A. That is going to be something that judges will look for. If we put that measure together with measure 7 and 8, it's going to sound like this. So again, back to piano. Now measure 9. Really, 9 and 10 go together as one long crescendo. It's going to sound something like this. Making sure that the accents pop out. But again, not too strong. Taking us into measure 11, a triplet to a roll. And you could do this a couple different ways. I suggest practicing it both ways and then deciding how you'd like to do it. The first way would be to play the triplet and then use that triplet as the base or the skeletal pattern of the roll that follows it. So think 1 and a 2 and a 3. And then let the second one of the sets of those beats bounce. Then on beats 3 and 4, play 16th notes with letting the second of those bounce. That would sound something like this if I played the measure that way. Again, the first 2 beats all in triplets, the second 2 beats in 16th notes. If you would rather not try it that way, then you could play beat 2 with the same 16th note pattern that you're going to use for beat 4. So you would think triplet 2 E and a, 3 E and a 4 E. If I put the buzz in there, again, this is something that I suggest practicing both ways. And then after you've worked on it, you decide which way you think sounds the best. Now let's take a look at the last measure. The last measure can be tricky. The first accent that we see isn't on the downbeat like all of our other accents have been so far. It's on the and. And at the same time, we don't have a note on E because that first note is an eighth note. So that rhythm without the accent can be a little tricky in and of itself because we need to leave out that E. And then if we put the accent in there, it goes from the right to the left, back to the right. But notice the right doesn't have an accent, but that's what everyone's going to want to do. So now let's play it without placing that accent on. That is much trickier. That brings us to the end, the 2 flams. We have an option. A very historically common way to play that would be a left-hand flam, meaning the left hand plays the big note and the right hand plays the grace note, followed by a right-hand flam, where the right hand plays the big note and the left hand plays the little note. That would sound like this. Historically very common. If I put that in context and play the whole measure, you're going to get something that sounds like this. You want to be able to practice in such a way that you feel comfortable going back and forth between those left hand and right hand flams. However, I'll let you in on a little secret. No matter how much you practice making your left hand sound like your right hand will always sound more like your right hand than your left hand. So what you might want to do after practicing for many attempts at getting the left and right to sound the same, you might want to actually try playing it both as right hand. So in other words, instead of this, Just play 2 right hand flames. Give that a shot within the context of the measure. You might like that sound better. Again, this is going to be personal preference. You need to practice and decide which way you think sounds best for you. And this is true of the entire etude, not just those 2 portions of measure 11 and measure 12 that I've talked about you needing to decide, but really that's really true of every measure that you play on any instrument. You practice it as many ways as possible. That's like putting different tools in your toolbox. And then in the end, you decide which one you think that you can make sound the best. In this video, we're going to focus on the marimba portion of the audition page. That's lines 4 and 5, measures 14 through 21. Before we begin, we want to make sure that we're starting on the correct note. It's not just a B flat, but it's a very particular B flat. Oftentimes, when we're learning music, we play with our friends. So usually that means that somebody's standing lower on the marimba and somebody is standing higher on the marimba. And so in that case, we're not really worried about which B flat or which C or which E flat we're playing. We're just happy that we're playing one of those notes with our friends. But in this case, we want to make sure that we are in fact starting on the exact B flat that's notated on the page. And that's the B flat right below middle C. Then we begin with measure 14. One of the things that you're going to want to have with you all of the time, whenever you practice, is a metronome. This is set to 90 beats per minute, which is what our dotted quarter is for this etude. We're going to want to make sure that we practice with our metronome quite a bit. After all, good time is the most essential element of any music. Let's talk about specifically something with measure 1. So as we begin, we want to make sure that we play as consistent as possible. We have good time with our metronome. We're starting in the correct place in the marimba. Now we want to be consistent. As we play left hand to right hand, oftentimes right-handed players will have their right hand play a little more dominant than the other, and left-hand players would be the opposite. In my case, I'm right-handed. So if I'm not careful, I might actually play the first measure something like this. My right hand was obviously louder than my left hand. And that's not something that the judges are going to want to hear. That's something that's very easy for the judges to pick up on and notice that you're playing something not correct. So what we're going to do is we're going to really focus on making that left hand and right hand as even as possible. So play that measure over and over again. Even though it seems fairly easy, you're going to want to do that over and over again a lot of times. Let's turn on our metronome and let's just play that measure a couple times with the idea of focusing on our hands being consistent. Now that I feel like my hands are fairly consistent, let's talk about another idea. Once we're not sounding robotic, and yet our hands are nice and playing together and consistent, we want to think about some shaping. In this case, it just says mezzo forte, and it doesn't say to crescendo or decrescendo any of the notes. However, in that idea to avoid sounding robotic, we want to give the line some shape. Kind of a default setting with playing mallet instruments is that if there is no crescendo or decrescendo written, follow the line. In other words, as the notes travel up, bring the volume up slightly, and as the notes travel down, bring the volume down slightly. So in that case, measure 14 is going to sound something like this. You can hear a slight crescendo, slight decrescendo. It's not written in the music, but it's something that we want to add just to make it sound more musical. Then, in measures 15 and 16, we do have a very specific long crescendo written. 2 measures is a long time to do a crescendo. So in order for the listeners to be able to understand exactly what we're trying to convey, your job is going to be to start that first note as soft as possible. So maybe that would be something like this. And then when you get to the end, your last couple of notes play nice and loud. So if we put that together, those two measures might sound something like this, starting extra soft, ending extra loud. Then in the next measure, measure 17, we want to make sure that we drop down, all the way back down to piano again. This is a transition. It's not really about the melodic content, but it throws in that A flat when it's not written in the key signature. But that one A flat is going to lead us to the next measure where there are 3 flats written in, and A flat becomes one of the notes inside of that key. So that measure is going to sound something like this. Again, soft to loud. That brings us now to our new key with 3 flats. In this measure, it sounds an awful lot like what we played in measure 14 at the beginning of the piece. Nice and forte, with that same type of shaping that we added. Now we're going to have 2 dotted quarters. Again, thinking about our metronome, we want to make sure that we don't rush. We just played a bunch of eighth notes within that time. Da 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 dum. We want to make sure that now we don't rush those isolated dotted quarters on the F note and on the D. You can hear there's quite a bit of space in between those notes. So again, always practicing with the metronome, making sure that we don't rush or drag. But in this case, we're probably going to rush if we're not careful. Then, after those dotted quarter notes, we're going to start soft and get to forte again, but this time, not on a long trajectory, but a very short one. Only a couple of notes. Sounds like this. So it's only 3/8 notes ending on a dotted quarter. That brings us to measure 20. In measure 20, we have a roll on C and then again on A flat. Notice these rolls are not connected, so we want to have a little space in between those. There's a very particular reason for that I'll talk about in just one second. So to make sure these rolls are not connected, we do not want it to sound like this. We want there to be a little bit of space. So make sure that you hear that space. And here's the reason for that. We're going to play forte on the C and on the A flat, but then our very next note, the B flat, is very soft. If we're connecting that and the A flat connects right into the B flat, it's way more difficult to play the B flat piano if we're rolling at a forte level. So the disconnect between those rolls is going to help us to play the B flat as quiet as possible. Again, that's going to sound something like this. Now we just crescendo as we play our last line. In this video, we're going to be focusing on the timpani portion of the audition page. That's the last 2 lines, measures 23 through 35. We have our metronome set up to 140 BPM. For timpani, it's a very unique thing for us as percussionists. None of the instruments that we play typically do we have to actually tune. But here with the timpani that we do. We're going to want to use the 2 middle drums because that's where these notes are going to fit the best for us. The lower drum, or the 29-inch drum, we're going to tune that to an A, and the 26-inch drum, or the higher drum, we're going to tune that to a D. That'll give us a nice, perfect fourth in between those 2 notes. When we play, if we're going slow enough, it allows us to do what we call adjacent dampening. That simply means to dampen one note while you play the other. So if we're playing nice slow notes, as I'm playing one note, I'm setting my hand on the other drum and dampening that one so that we hear a very clear pitch, one note to the next, and so that we're trying to avoid having both of those notes ringing at the same time. If we're playing fast enough, that's not really possible. But if we're going slow enough, it can. In this case, we are moving fast because we're at 140, but we're playing just quarter notes at the beginning. So we do have time to do some adjacent dampening. It would sound something like this. Any faster than that, and this idea might not work. But if you can get your hands to move that quick, it really sets you apart and sounds very musical. It's a way to have clear definition in our pitches. Later on, as we're playing faster, that's simply not going to be possible. So anytime that there is an opportunity to do that, it's always worth practicing and giving it a try. So at the beginning, it's going to sound like this. And that way, they're not ringing against each other. Very clear. The next measure, measure 25, has a quarter note rest on beat 2. So on that note, you are going to want to dampen both drums. And I say both because even though you just played here, at the beginning of that measure, you played on this drum. And it's still going to be ringing. So it's going to sound something like this. You want to make sure you dampen that on beat 2. And then that's followed by playing even softer, 2 A's, and then releasing up on the upper note. And again, make sure that we dampen. So if I play that first line all together, it's going to sound something like this. That takes us to the next line. Measure 29, we have to think about how we want to do our sticking here. Generally speaking, our sticking is determined by where we're coming from or where we're going to. In this case, in measure 29, it's going to be determined by where we're going to. So if we start the quarter note with the right hand, we could then start the eighth notes with either hand, either with the left or the right. In measure 28, I played it right, left on those eighth notes, so that I could have the downbeat at 29 be that right hand again. However, if I were to do that in measure 29, my left hand would have to cross over to play that upper drum. I don't want to do that. So instead, on beat 2, I'm going to start with my left hand. So let's practice that together. Let's play left, right, right. Just those 4 notes. Now that's going to set us up to be able to get back down to play the downbeat on the low note in measure 30. So let's try that. If I put those 2 measures together, 29 and 30, it's now going to sound like this. Notice measure 30 starts with a forte piano roll. A good way to do forte piano rolls is to simply attack the note and then on the next beat start to roll. Remember, a roll is nothing more than our version of a tuba sustaining a long note. And if we start at forte, then we don't really need to have too many strokes in there if we're going to come back in piano and crescendo. So we can play it like this. So you can hit it with a single note, then a beat later, see it's still ringing, a beat later start your roll, and then get to that next measure. So again, going back to measure 29, it's going to sound something like this. Again, quarter note rest, 16th notes, starting softer. Sounds very, very similar to 30, going to 31, but now instead of a roll, it's simply 16th notes. Now, the same thing again. Notice at the end we have molto rit. All of us know that retardando is meaning that we're going to slow down. The word molto means a lot. So we're going to slow down a lot more than maybe you think you should. So when you get to that ending, it allows us to be very dramatic. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Good luck on the audition. Happy practicing.